Congratulations! We're now at Module 1.2 of the first course, Risk Management, meaning that you've passed the test for Module 1.1, so congratulations are definitely in order. And I'd also like to share an important tip with you at this point, and that is this. We reserve the right to ask questions on tests regarding any of the information that we present in any of the modules in this program. However, if I ever indicate that something is either important or maybe even very important, you should assume that there's an extremely high probability that you'll see a test question related to this information. And maybe not only on the module-related test, but also the course-related test and even the final test, or any combination or all of those for the items indicated as important. So that's an important tip to keep in mind. You should be taking some notes as you proceed through this material, but pay very close attention to items that I indicate as either important or very important. Housekeeping announcement. Now, one of the big takeaways from Module 1.1 is that you operate in a liability-rich environment, and I discussed several examples to underscore that fact. Another major takeaway from Module 1.1 is that we strongly recommend that you focus on risk management throughout this certification program. And in this module, I'd like to drill down a little bit into risk management and suggest to you that there are two types of risks that you should be focusing on. The first type of risk involves content-related risks. And when we're thinking about those, we're concerned about violating the rights of others. If we violate the rights of others, then we can be subject to some fairly serious liability. So one type of content-related risk would be unfair competition. And we provided a discussion of an example there of an unfair competition type of risk, with this case involving a lawsuit by Katherine Heigl against the Duane Reade Drug Store based on a claim of false endorsement. That was an example that we talked about. Another type of content-related risk would be intellectual property. If others have rights in intellectual property and we violate those, we could be subject to very substantial liability. And we also presented and discussed an example, and here it is, Grumpy Cat, with the understanding that Grumpy's owners have filed and secured registrations for copyright in a whole series of Grumpy Cat images, and also have secured a registered trademark in the name Grumpy Cat. So any use of any of these images without permission could subject you to intellectual property liability in the form of copyright and or trademark infringement. Again, another example that we've discussed. So in review, there's the first type of risk, content-related risks, and you see the two examples, unfair competition and intellectual property. Now, the second type of risk would be risks related to advertising itself. And when we think about advertising-related risks, our concern is consumer deception, deceiving consumers in some way, which regulators, primarily the Federal Trade Commission, views as actionable under the Federal Trade Commission Act. So what would be one type of a consumer deception advertising related risk? That would be an advertisement that is deceptive in its format. So we have one example in Module 1.1 involving this social media post by Kim Kardashian and on Instagram. And if you are a typical consumer you may not understand that this is really an advertisement. There's no disclosure here that would indicate that it's a paid ad or an advertisement or hashtag ad or any type of disclosure of that nature, right? It simply looks like Kim Kardashian saying, as she posts there, I have 2 of these a day as part of my hair routine. They are delish, she says. So many consumers might decide or conclude that this is not an ad. It's simply Kim sharing her preference for vitamins, right? So this would be an example possibly of a deception in the form of format. There can also be deception in the messaging itself, either because your claims are either partially true or partially not true, or partially true, but you omit providing material information, which would be material to a consumer. Therefore, the advertising message is misleading and deceptive. That would be one example. Another type would be a failure of a self-enforcement requirement. You recall there were several examples in Module 1.1 where regulators have imposed self-enforcement on brands and agencies, which is essentially a management-related problem. So here are 2 additional types of advertising risks. And we had one particular example which illustrates both of those types of risk. Now, when this slide was presented, I indicated that we've always known that affiliates themselves, right, that affiliates will be held liable for their deceptive marketing claims, their deceptive ad claims. We've known that. And this guy right here, he's either an affiliate or an advertiser, but he's very, very concerned about potential liability. So affiliates have always been held liable for deceptive marketing claims, advertising claims. But we also learned that advertisers are now being held liable under a failure to self-enforce. Again, it's a management-related issue. So here was one example that really points out 2 types of advertising risks. So here's the summary then in the second category of risk related to advertising involving some kind of consumer deception as to format or the actual messaging itself, or simply a failure to perform self-enforcement obligations. All right, so here is my diagram of the way content and advertising messages flow from left to right to the internet, right? Now, this is not perfect, obviously. It's just a simple illustration of how things work. But I want you to understand that we're going to be talking about this type of flow of content and also advertising messages. And we include here the players in this situation involving brands and digital marketers, sometimes one and the same, right? Also agencies. And content does originate in some cases from consumers. We call that type of content user-generated content, or UGC. So that in many cases is used in social media posts. And so you see how all of this flows from left to right to the World Wide Web. So this is really a broad brush view of the landscape that we're going to be talking about. But more specifically, we'll be talking about, for the remainder of this certification program, content and advertising risk management. We've come full circle now, and we're going to focus on certain types of legal rules, legal regulations, legal precedent. One would be regulatory in nature, and of course, we're going to focus almost exclusively on the Federal Trade Commission. States are involved in regulations, advertising regulations affecting consumers, but we're going to focus on the FTC because there's often a lot of overlap between the Federal Trade Commission Act and the various state consumer protection statutes. We will be discussing intellectual property, primarily copyright and trademark, but I think we'll have a brief coverage and discussion on trade secrets and confidential information. Third, we'll be talking a lot about privacy and publicity rights. And then last but not least, we'll talk about the Lanham Act and specifically claims related to false endorsement and competitor claims between competitors involving false advertising. So this concludes Module 1.2, which concludes the first course in risk management. Coming up next, course number 2, copyright, and Module 2.1, subject matter.